Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in to Alex Griffin's Artist Talk. My name is Lillian Day Thorpe, and I'm the director of Nancy Margolis Gallery. Today, Alex and I are going to chat about the paintings in his current exhibition, Eveningland, which is his third solo show with NMG. Before diving into the conversation, I'd like to share a few words about Alex. Based in East Falls, Philadelphia, he earned his BFA in painting and printmaking from Virginia Commonwealth University. His work has appeared in solo and group exhibitions throughout the US and is included in private collections nationwide and abroad. Alex's paintings have been reviewed in the Brooklyn Rail, and he was the subject of a 2023 interview by Yale University Radio. After our conversation, there will be time to ask questions or make comments. Feel free at any point during the conversation to type a question into the chat box and I can read it aloud at the end, or you can click on the raise hand icon and I will call on you. Alex, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Shoot, I just did something. Okay, yeah.
Oops. Okay. Amazing. So I would love to begin by talking about two fundamental concepts, time and place. And starting with place, your last two exhibitions with the Nancy Margolis Gallery seemed to fuse elements from the real world with ethereal images that feel more like dream states than specific locations. Do the paintings in Eveningland continue that trend? And maybe using this painting as a jumping off point, how would you describe the settings of your compositions? Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
There we go.
yeah, this is an interesting piece because it's kind of cobbled together. None of the elements in this painting are from my personal life, like photos I've taken or my neighborhood or anything. It's imagined, and I believe that those cypress-looking trees on the left, which I like painting. You see them in a lot of Renaissance paintings, in like Italian paintings, or probably from a photo. I can't recall completely. But I believe everything else is pretty much just imagined. Well, I definitely looked at photos of benches because I cannot draw a bench from like memory. But yeah, and then the structure of the houses, that's kind of my default when I think of a house, you know. So, but anyhow, yeah, this painting is pretty thin for me as far as layers go. There's, especially in the front, there's just a few layers. And that could be difficult for me to feel like I've finished a painting when it's that thin. I always feel like I need to keep building. So for instance, with this, I just let it sit for a while because my instinct was just to keep painting and painting.
Right.
But I felt satisfied with it.
I feel like the sort of gauziness, the atmosphere that you've created, it gives it a very cinematic quality.
Right. Yeah, and we've talked about cinema and still shots, you know. Both of us have talked about our interest in film and how it influences painting. Yes, and this does feel very cinematic to me.
And sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that the figure was actually meant to be a sculpture.
And you're referring to this figure here. Yep.
Yes. And to me, it reads either way. But I feel like most people probably see, you know, some figure. And Yeah, and I think I've spoken to you about this. For whatever reason, this painting feels, I've never been to Belgium. I have no connection to Belgium, but it feels like a wealthy neighborhood in Belgium, and that's just been in my head since I've looked at it. There's something about it. It's like a park, a European park, and it's very calm and very still,
Mhm.
like a film still.
Right.
And I just have an instinct that it's a wealthy environment, a calm, and yeah, for some reason, which wasn't intentional, but sticks
There
out to
is something very sort of stately and courtly about it. And in the past, we've talked about how your paintings sort of, in terms of setting, occupy an in-between world or an in-between state. And the title of your exhibition and this painting is Eveningland. And I feel like that that title invites the viewer to um, sort of view your paintings as more of an imagined environment, since Eveningland is a, fictional place. It doesn't exist on the map. So it sort of positions the viewer in this, um, you know, imagined, conjured world just from the title alone. Mhm.
and yes, and I love the title Eveningland. It also feels cinematic to me.
Yes, absolutely.
Um, and so
And,
it really works for me.
and sort of the counterpoint of place is time. Um, I'm really curious how you think about time in your paintings and while you paint, if it's something you think about at all. Um, since, working with you the last few years, one comment I keep hearing, and I feel it myself, is your paintings evoke a sense of longing and nostalgia. They feel somewhat weathered and like portals into, maybe a bygone era. And I'm curious, is that, a conscious decision that you're thinking about as you're painting? Do you feel like your paintings sort of are indicative of earlier times?
Yeah, it's an interesting. It's interesting because I do not consciously want my paintings to feel like they're from a certain time period.
Mhm.
Um, like I don't want this to. My intention was to not make this feel like it's from, I don't know, the early 20th century or the 19th century, or even I guess it could even be even older. Um, but it could also be today on some level. So yeah, my intention is just to make my painting just feel complete, and I don't know how that'll end up. And it often does, like with this, it feels southern to me,
Mm.
and it feels um like I spent a lot of time in Richmond, Virginia, most of my 20s. And this, I didn't intentionally make this painting thinking of Richmond, but looking at it, it's very lush. And I made this painting in the summer. Um, and it's definitely has a haunted feeling. I can go with that term. And Richmond's a very haunted city. Um, it empties out in the summer and is completely like when the students leave, it just feels very quiet, very desolate at times in certain parts of the city. Um,
I like that we can see these, they look like dresses without figures inside of them. And I think that sort of, um, you know, evokes that haunting sense that you were describing. Um, and it gives the presence of, figures, or at least the sense that figures have been in the scene, even if we're not, physically seeing them in this composition. And it sort of recalls history and overlapping time. It has this really sort of powerful way of making the viewer think about time in your work.
I like that, the dresses can, yeah, and they can be stand-ins for other things, you know, they do look ghostly to me, which makes you think of time in certain ways, but they could also be, I don't know, actual people. And I think of them moving into the scene
Yes,
as opposed to coming towards me,
right.
towards the viewer. But if the viewer sees it another way, that's fine. And yeah, they were the last thing I painted in this. Like this was a painting that probably was 3 different paintings over a couple years. That, you know, I would paint something, leave it because I wasn't satisfied with it, come back to it 6 months later, do something, wasn't satisfied with it, and then I made the painting relatively quickly, the final image relatively quickly last summer. And I believe the last thing I added was the figures in the front. And um,
I have a feeling that your process and your technique or techniques um, are, one of the reasons in which your paintings evoke this sense of longing. Um, this one in particular feels very physical and frenetic. It also does remind me of the summer. It feels hot and heavy and like
mhm.
overgrown. Um, and yeah, maybe just could you talk a little bit about the techniques? I see that it's oil on panel. Sometimes you work with wax. Um, how do you create this sort of swirling physicality to the surface?
Yeah, so I don't remember the paintings that were behind this particular, you know, painting. I can't recall at all what was behind this, but there's a lot of layers, heavy layers that, you know, it takes a long time for that to dry, especially when you're using oil pastels, which I do use, and kind of pure pigment sticks. Um, so yeah, and you can feel that even if you can't see it, I personally can feel the heaviness and the depth of what's behind it. You know, you could a thin painting and a really heavy painting have different, almost emotional weights to them, at least for me. And this feels heavier,
Mm,
ear earthier.
mm,
If that's not really a word, but yeah, it's as far as the techniques, I believe I used a pure pigment stick and kind of came across the top of this, and you can see how that's smeared
mm,
things. And then I etched into all the layers to get the little windows.
mhm.
So yes, so the underpaintings are coming through with the windows. Like um I was using some tool to cut through. There's a lot of cutting in this painting as well. Like here in the middle, there's a tree that's cut into the wood. Parts of the houses are cut, and it's like when I see a painting in person, I often respond to paintings that look to me like they have a history behind them, you know, like thicker paintings that took not necessarily took more time, because it's not about like I spent a ton of time on this painting, but through, you know, a period over a year, maybe it was a number of different paintings, and that comes across, at least to me
Mm.
personally. And it has a a real, I don't know, um, feels deeper to me on some level
For
than
sure. And
not that there aren't successful thin paintings, because there are.
Mhm.
It's just, yeah,
Including some of yours, some of your thinner paintings.
sure.
But yeah, I love how we can really see your hand and feel your hand in a painting like this. When you were reviewed in the Brooklyn Rail, the author wrote, Griffin's paintings pause time while simultaneously educing a fleeting emotional and physical surge. And I've always loved that quote because I feel like she really hit the nail on the head. And you do have this sort of duality in your paintings of, um, in a way, they feel like old snapshots. Time is frozen. But on the other hand, there's so much movement in them. And I love how she said physical surge. I really feel motion. And as you said, it looks like the figures are moving in and sort of propelling towards the center.
That's a conscious decision to have, because I am so influenced by I'm influenced by painting in general, other painters, and I'm also heavily influenced by film and by still images. So if you're watching film or you're looking at still images, that doesn't necessarily translate to a painting, because a painting needs to have more move. At least for me, a paint, like, it's a conscious decision. Like the figures, I feel like if the figures were not there in this painting, it would not have
Mm,
movement
mm,
that it needs to work.
that's so
Um,
true. I agree. Yeah.
it would feel, I just don't think it would be successful. I think it became successful when the figures came into play, and I I liked this painting immediately, and I was like, this works. It wasn't a painting that I had to think about. It was something I was really happy about.
I love
And
that.
yeah.
Um, Speaking of sort of the physicality and the sensory component, to me, your paintings activate my senses, and I'm particularly interested in their auditory effect. I feel like each of your paintings has its own volume and sound. This painting, for instance, to me, it sounds very turbulent and windy, and the sounds I'm hearing are not man-made sounds, but the sounds of nature, um, like wind crashing and or winds blowing and the waves crashing and sort of a cacophony of seagulls. And by contrast, a painting like this one, it sounds much quieter and it feels, somewhat placid and serene. Do you ever think about, you know, the quietness or the noisiness of your paintings as you're working? To me, they have such a profound, um, that's such a big part of them to me. I'm wondering if that's something you think about.
Well, after I didn't, until speaking with you, really, like, because I know that, like, over the years speaking with
Mhm.
you, it quite the I know you in your own way. I'm not going to articulate what your views are, but you do think about quietness and sound or peacefulness, or you know. And so now I do think about it, mainly from, and I see it, and I'm very aware of it now. But I wasn't always, but now I'm very aware of it.
Mhm.
And yes, this painting, um, view from Forbidden Drive, Wissahickon, which is the park near my house, is a very quiet, definitely a winter painting, which lends itself to that, as opposed to, generally speaking, a summer painting for me. The the this is relatively silent, and this is one of the pieces in the show that is not oil based. It's water based. And oftentimes when I work with water-based materials, I limit the colors, or I use really subtle colors. I mean, there's probably 5 or 6 colors in this, but you could also look at it and feel like it's basically, gray and black with some white. But it, and that's always been that's a conscious decision often when I work with acrylic based mediums and watercolors and things like that, and it just ends up that way, where I limit my palette, as opposed to when I'm oil painting, I'll have just a mess of oil paints around me and all these colors and things. And there's different ways to get layers with a water-based painting. It's like,
Yeah, I
you have
wonder
to be,
if
no,
that plays a role in the quietness. This one is, as you said, a water-based painting, and by contrast to something like this one, Midday Flowers, which again is oil, this painting is very uh, three-dimensionally built up. In person, the pink leaves or flowers are really protruding from the canvas, and there's so much sort of physical texture. And I wonder if just sort of the washiness of the acrylic gives it this more serene um, impression. And
it
again, just
can
less
for
oil.
sure.
Mhm.
And that's, yeah, as opposed to Winter Lullaby, which is um similar to the painting we were recently looking at. Yeah,
Mhm.
in that it was a number of different paintings over a period of time, and then eventually it ended this way, um, where you can see the cutting through in a lot of different layers coming out, and you'd have to wait a month or two or more for it to fully dry to put another layer on that wasn't going to blend with what was beneath it. Well, oil paint will always blend with what's beneath it if you were, generally speaking, but with the Wissahickon, it's um, it dries in, I don't know, sometimes half an hour, sometimes quicker, depending on how you're using the material. So there are still layers here, but you don't have to wait a long time at all. And what I used for this painting, which is kind of a new technique for me, was I would put a layer down and then I would put a varnish over it, which completely protects it from whatever you put on top. Then I would put another whatever I want on top of that varnish, and then put another. I think there's probably 2 varnishes, so there's 3 separate layers in this, and I know what's standing out from what's beneath the varnish. And for example, the trees at the top and the structures at the top do come out to me because they are on top of all the varnishes and layers. And um, yeah, and in the end, this really, I walk through the park and there's just ridges on either side of the park. And I've always imagined, well, there were Revolutionary War battles around where I live. I don't know if they were in the park,
Mhm.
but it's also, Native Americans lived here, forever. So I always imagined there was some type of, you know, battles or hunters up on the ridges. And now I'm just walking through there as, some guy who lives in Philadelphia, but the history is there and it's always interesting to me. And I got really into for a short period of time, I got into like pyramids and things. There's like a little pyramid in there.
Right. I don't know if we can see over Zoom, but there is a, a faint um, etching or hint of a pyramid here. Um, and what technique did you use to make, this pyramid? There's also a polar bear, I think, standing up right behind that. I wanted to talk about your use of drawing, and some of these look like drawn elements, and none were included in this exhibition, but you are a pretty prolific drawer. And how does drawing make its way into your paintings? This one really seems like it has drawn components.
Yeah, the two acrylic water-based paintings in the show could be on paper, really. I
Mhm.
mean, they would have to be pretty, they couldn't be on paper necessarily because there's certain elements that would kind of not work with paper, but I could see this being on paper. I'm using pen, at the top and even in pencil. And I used ballpoint pen, that's actually a ballpoint pen for the pyramid or whatever it might be. Whenever I see a pyramid, I also think of the monuments in DC and the bear, which I don't know why I painted that or where it came. I'm afraid of bears. It's a weird thing because there's a lot of bears in Connecticut where I go and they're everywhere. But yeah, don't know how he ended up there, but I like him. And so I used pen, pencil, gouache, and then I know they're there, but people might not see them, but there are figures at the bottom.
Yes, there's that motif of the dresses, which we saw in a painting before, and we will keep seeing in, paintings to come.
Right. And they were it's a little stick, a little like a watercolor stick. It's kind of this weird little material I found at the art store. So that yeah, there's a lot of different water-based materials in this, which is fun to work with and is completely different process than oil painting. You don't
Right.
have to be patient. You don't have to, you can just change it and yeah.
Well, I like it when you say things like, I have no idea how that bear got there, because it really sort of signifies how much of an intuitive, sort of instinctual painter you are. And one thing we're going to talk about pretty soon is your use of symbols. And in a way, I feel like so many of these images are part of your growing collection of symbols that you keep using and repeating. And you seem to use them in a very sort of subconscious manner. They appear and sometimes they surprise you when they're pointed out because you didn't even realize putting them in there. Um, Speaking of which, we'll just get right to it. So this one, the gatekeepers and the angel, I feel like this one painting combines all or most of your sort of characteristic techniques and styles and motifs. We have repeated symbols, for instance, the ladder, which shows up in many of your paintings, unusual creatures, figures with top hats, moons, an angel. There are areas of that are really opaque and solid, and areas that are transparent and sort of ghostly. There is a blend of figuration and abstraction. And with all of that in mind, I thought this would be a good one for you to just sort of walk us through the entire process of, on a very basic level, how did this painting come about, or how did it start? Um,
Sure. So this one is also similar to Wissahickon in that it's very tied to my drawing practice.
mhm.
And this is on an incredibly smooth piece of panel, I actually bought the panel, and it was had a it was primed like perfectly for that purpose, for if you want to work on the smoothest material possible, essentially, that's not paper. So this feels like paper to me. And I don't really remember how I initially started, but the house is something that is always is often a central uh, focus of my work. And I I'm sure I started from the house and then kind of built out from there. After putting a few hazy, kind of abstract washes and things in the background, I made the house, then made the people and the animals and the angel, the things surrounding the house. And I this was an interesting painting because I usually don't know what I've done per se, uh, narratively, when I make a painting, but I actually see a strong narrative in this. It's one of the only paintings where when I finished it, I took a step back, and after a couple weeks or something, and I felt like I was seeing something. And for me, I see, uh, well, there's an angel, so that represents something religious, obviously. And the stairs or the ladder, I see that as going up. Well, I've thought about this. I never see my ladders going down. I always think of them as going upwards,
Mhm.
the movement at least. And for me, this is like a kind of a painting where the two figures, the two people, they're not actually people. They're uh, spirits of some sort. They don't live in the house. I think of them as workers. They're as they're working on some level and gatekeeping a certain type of movement into the spirit realm, if you will. And um yeah, that's I don't know why, but that feels, they're not like a lot of my paintings, people will be outside of the house and they will be a part of the house, like they'll live in the house. But these figures are separate, and they're kind of protecting, they're protecting something.
Mhm. That's so interesting. And to me, this painting really has a theatrical sort of orchestrated component to it. Um, Not so much with this body of work as your last body of work, where you depicted, actual stages, with curtains and they looked like plays. This one does sort of almost hint at a stage, at least to me. And I think the way that you've framed the action, it feels, you know, that adds to the, composed, orchestrated sense. Do you ever feel like you are I don't know, director of sorts, sort of orchestrating these figures? Um, do you think about the quiet drama happening in your paintings, and how the figures are interacting with one another and their surrounding landscape?
I do, with something like this for certain.
Mm.
Like I didn't know why I was doing it, and it was still an intuitive process, but I was very thoughtful about where I placed the animals and the people. Um, and I oftentimes I do want there to be a drama, like not necessarily a drama, but enough happening in the work where you can be a little challenged by it. It can be a conflict. I like a subtle conflict.
Mhm.
And I think oftentimes with figures, just with my work, I do that by, at least in my view, they always tend to have a disconnect from each other. They're not always, they don't feel like they're in a conversation with each other. They're not connected. The two main figures are separate.
Mhm. Yeah,
Um,
physically, they look like they're turned away from one another.
right.
And even these animals are also going in opposite directions. And then the angel is physically separated from this sort of abstract barrier, or by that barrier.
I,
It is
yeah,
challenging. Mhm.
and I feel like the angel is kind of looking over all of this,
Mhm.
and I think, it's a feminine, and well, at least this angel's feminine for me for whatever reason. She's looking over the scene.
Mhm. And you touched on it, but um, I won't ask you what your symbols mean because I think they really are intuitive, but you might read into it and think of a ladder as, something in which you ascend. And there is something ethereal about your paintings. And it's this one in particular sort of hints at themes of, you know, the afterlife and other realms of consciousness. It starts to become a very metaphysical painting.
For sure. It's it could look like a folk, elements of it look like a folk painting, of a farm.
For sure.
It
Mhm.
does feel like a farm, maybe, but it's kind of like a spiritual farm.
I love that.
Like, like, yeah.
And another way in which you could read into it is a lot of your paintings to me feel like memories. And I think we can see that here in the sense that certain components are very vivid and clear, and others seem to be fading away, almost like ghostly images, in the same way that a memory can be both, sharp and hazy. And also knowing your love of history and layering, I think my personal interpretation of this painting before you talked about it was you were showing sort of all of the histories at one time of, the inhabitants of this land. I feel like I'm looking at, the animals and the residents who lived in these houses, and you're showing them simultaneously in different levels of transparency. So it does give this timeless quality. It looks like I'm seeing, multiple times at once, and they don't feel like they're really right in front of me. It's feels like a mishmash of memories and imagination.
I like that. Yeah, I like that this doesn't feel like one time period,
Mhm.
that it's, yes, like it, uh, just kind of, yeah. I like that it's not one time period, that
Yeah.
yeah, it's a couple time periods.
Mhm.
Yeah.
At
Like
least.
where,
Mhm.
and my works on paper and works with acrylic, yeah, that that often comes into play for whatever reason. Yeah. But more than one time, more than, they feel like they could be more than one place. Yeah,
An in-between world.
for sure.
Yeah. An Eveningland. And one other thing I wanted to mention while we're on this painting is I often hear your works described as portals. I've heard that countless times since working with you. And looking at this one, I really do get the sense of a portal. And I think it helps that you've framed it with this border. So it does look like we're actually looking into something that is in a different realm. Do you think of your paintings as portals? Do you see what people mean when they say that?
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know. I don't know. Many people have independently used that word for my work. Uh, And I never, yeah, no, there was never an intention to make portals,
Mhm.
but there must be something to it because there's been so many people that have said that to me.
Mhm.
So, um, I don't know if it's a portal. It's, it's, I mean, it's religious in nature. I do think so. There's, um, it could, hints at the afterlife,
Mhm.
hints at different, so, that's a portal on some
Mhm.
level from, you know, life and death. So it makes sense if someone sees that.
And sort of a portal in the same way um, that if you come across, a found photograph and you don't know the people in them, they're strangers to you, but it sort of thrusts you into a different time and place, and you feel the ambiance and the atmosphere of that location, which you've probably never been to, but it does sort of have a time capsule element. Mhm.
Yeah, I love, going, to uh, stores where you can look through, old photos and things, and it's always kind of sad actually when you see that these photos have ended up in a store somewhere.
Totally. But
Family
it's a nice
photos.
surprise when you run across them.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I'm curious because I think one of the things, and here's a detail, one of the elements that sort of drives your narratives are your titles. And titles are infamously difficult to come up with, both for individual paintings and the exhibition as a whole. But I think your titles are so interesting. And to me, um, they create conversations and they raise questions and they sort of fill in the blanks to a narrative that we don't necessarily see depicted in the painting. Um, so this painting, for instance, After Party, could you just talk about your process of coming up with titles and how you landed on the title After Party for this painting?
Titles are incredibly difficult for me, um, because I do work pretty intuitively. So, you know, I it's I don't quite know what I'm doing. So if you don't know what you're doing necessarily, I mean, I don't know what I'm doing from the start. It's hard to come up with a concrete title because I know a lot of people, a lot of painters or artists I talk to, they are very comfortable with their titles. I'm not, but I enjoyed. This is probably the first time I enjoyed making titles for this show. I spent more time thinking about the titles, and I'm happy with them for because I could have just titled this some form of still life or something,
Right.
but I titled it After Party, and I think by doing that, it gives the viewer a connotation of something that they may not have seen without the title, which is an interesting practice. And like for me, this painting, there was a party, and I think of the dresses as people maybe driving home, leaving the party. They're not dresses. They represent like the aftermath of a party.
Mhm.
You know, people are drinking, it's late, and I don't know, for some reason I visualized that it's just people driving home from a party, maybe in the country,
Mhm.
and giving it a, yeah, I never, this is the first time I've given this type of title to a painting. So that was an interesting process.
It's really effective, and I love how it sort of informs the narrative. And as you said, it sets the viewer up with a specific context through which to enter into the work. And of course, an after party, um, it gives the impression that at one point in time there were people here, even if we don't see them right now. I mean, maybe we see their dresses fading away into the distance, but we don't see them, in their physical form. But I like how just the use of the title triggers my imagination to um, um, think of people in this scene. And that's pretty powerful that sort of all of your titles help to round out the composition and the narratives happening.
Yeah, it's interesting because part of me doesn't want a title for my paintings because I just want the viewer to take whatever they see and not what I'm. It adds it's an interesting thing. I don't know if I want to continue doing such a heavy narrative title, but I like it with this, and but yeah, it's I have a conflict with titles because I they can add things that might not be there
Mm,
um,
mm.
to the viewer. So it is a conflict. But I with this one and a number of the ones in this show I enjoyed it. Yeah.
Another interesting painting with an interesting title is The Messengers of Autumn after Clay. I believe you borrowed that title from a Paul Klee painting.
Right.
Yeah. And I think it is very apt for this work. Um, I just wanted to touch on this painting. To me, it feels like a shift in your work. Um, for one thing that I notice, the figures are taking up a large portion of the panel, as opposed to some of your other paintings in this show where the figures are more like characters in the background carrying on a scene. But here you seem to really make the focus on the relationship between these two figures. And did this one feel different to you as you were making it, or um, you don't need to discuss the meaning in depth, but I was curious if this, when you painted this in relation to the other works in the show, and if you noticed a shift in this work versus the other paintings.
It's definitely not a painting um doesn't feel like me. And I made it last summer. I don't know where it came from. I really don't. Well, the mountains are not, they're not on the east coast of the United States where most of my settings are. I do know that they're somewhere else. Um, and I used a clear primer to start the painting off, so there's no white background. There's just a clear. When you put a clear primer down, it leaves the wood surface there. And I put this mountain down and then took a rag and kind of just went into the brown kind of mix there and created the people out of using a rag. and you can see through them, and that's essentially the wood surf. They're created, and the wood surface is what you're seeing.
Mhm. So like in this face, for instance, it's not that you painted the face, you actually subtracted paint, you took paint away, you wiped it away.
Right, exactly. And I I made this, for as far as my process, pretty quickly.
Mhm.
And it was an odd thing because it doesn't feel like me, and I finished it and I was like, I was like, it's like that works, but it doesn't feel like me. So I put it away for, a couple weeks, and then brought it back out to look at it again, and it still worked. It just didn't feel like me. And I guess I've spoken to a few people about it, and I guess maybe I thought there wasn't a conflict. Like, even you and I've talked about a film, how there's, for a successful film, there's got to be some kind of conflict or something,
Mhm.
rise and fall or whatever. And I just didn't, I felt like they were almost too connected, and there wasn't, I don't know. But after talking to to people, I've realized that the female figure is looking out at the viewer, and the male figure is looking at the female figure,
Mhm.
like, directly. So there is a disconnect. And I guess also the little river going across them creates maybe some tension. So I'm happy with that. I didn't.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, to me, I love this painting and it's not straightforward. And there is that challenge and tension, definitely tension, um, that keeps me looking and wondering. And just to wrap up, because I would like to get to a couple questions from the audience, you have continued your series of paintings on found cigar boxes, which I love. And part of the nature of these works is they're very small in scale, and they're also on found objects. So I was just curious if you could talk about what draws you to, working on this scale and with this substrate in particular. What draws you to this cigar box series?
I've always loved small work. Like, when I go to a museum, I'm often drawn to the smallest works in the museum, and they can be the most powerful, I think. And so I've worked on different surfaces that are small for a very long time. And over the past couple years, I started to work on cigar boxes. There's a store. Yeah. Anyway, there's a store in Philadelphia where I get a lot of these from. And it's interesting because I don't quite know why. I can't put my finger on it, but there's you almost get a head start when you work with a cigar box, because not it's been touched by other people. It's had a use, um, and it has almost like a charge to it that you don't get from just a piece of wood that you might buy from the art store, or you might just cut for yourself.
Mhm.
It has, especially in person, that they seem to have a little extra charge of sorts to them. And I also feel a certain amount of freedom when I work on cigar boxes, because they're so small. I often use just pure pigment,
Mhm.
either pigment sticks or oil pastels, and that gives them a thickness that I really like.
I love the way that you're describing it as a head start. I definitely sense that. And what's so unique about the cigar boxes is they have each one is enriched with prior histories, and all the histories are different. As you said, they had past owners and handlers, and sort of circling back to our conversation about the sensory experience of your paintings. These works are experienced not simply through sight, but through touch. And they encourage you to pick them up and turn them around and hold them. And they're really intimate. I love that about these. And they sort of encourage you to, re-experience them over and over. It's a nice way to tie history into your process.
Yeah, I didn't really think about how it can be. Yeah. I mean, they could be moved around, it could be on a wall or not on a wall. So they can, like, with a lot of art, it's in one place, but these are movable. Yeah.
They
Yeah. And
encourage
they've had a use, which is interesting too. Yeah. Even though it's, I don't know, it's still just a piece of wood, but it's had some use before I've done my thing with it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I am going to open it up to questions from the audience. We have a few minutes left. So Meredith, she said, you used the word instinct several times. I kept interpreting your work as about feeling in the emotional sense. Would you consider that interchangeable with instinct?
Yes, for sure.
I think so too.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, a successful painting just it either speaks to you or it doesn't. And so it either, like, kind of hits you emotionally or it doesn't,
Mhm,
So, like,
mhm.
whenever I see a painting, not mine even particular, it's any painting, I kind of know immediately if it hits me or it doesn't. So yeah, that's emotion for sure.
Amazing, thank you. This one is not a question, more of a comment from Jennifer. She says, Bonnard and probably others used see-through or transparent figures in his paintings. And that's true. Is Bonnard one of the artists that you are inspired by? You look
I
at?
love Bernard. Yeah, and there's currently a show in DC at the Phillips that I'm kicking myself because I haven't been to see. But it's a Bernard show down there. And yeah, I don't know, but he's one of those painters. I don't know how he makes his paintings. Like, you look at some painters, you kind of have an idea, but the colors he uses and the compositions, I can't think of a painter who's ever made that work. I don't know. They're kind of endless in the way some are really small too. The National Museum in DC has a few small ones that I've always,
Mm,
that's a good example when I say small paintings can be really powerful. There's a couple Bonnards and Vuillards that are, I think, together in DC, and they're really small and powerful.
amazing. Yeah, he's definitely a sort of singular figure in art history.
Right? Yeah, I think
Kirsten asks, how does Alex choose his palette before starting a painting?
so. That's a good question because, well, oftentimes I'll kind of just mess around and create an abstract. Uh, well, that's not. I don't know is the best answer for a lot of stuff. I just kind of put paint down because you have to have something, because the white canvas is intimidating for sure. So you got to put something down quickly or you'll get stuck. And so you put some colors down, and then the weird thing is I'll often start with a house or something, and I'll try to make a real house, like it looks like a real house, and then it will never look like a real house. And then who knows from there. But as far as colors, yeah, I think naturally I like muted colors and grays and things like that. But I start off I don't really know what I start out with per se. Yeah.
Seems like another case of instinct taking over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember in school that they would teach us to put down certain colors with, first, but I never do that.
So you don't start with like a base color and then sort of build it up from there.
No, it's almost like I'll start with an abstract. It'll
Mm,
be an abstract painting to start off almost always. Except, well, the water-based, that's a little bit different. That's
mhm.
more direct. But
That makes
with
sense.
oil, I'll start off with something that's abstract. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm glad that Kirsten asked that question because we didn't have a chance to touch on color in our
Yeah.
conversation. Um, but that was really insightful.
Thank
Uh,
you.
Thank you so much. It's 3 o'clock and I think we covered, a lot of amazing topics. Um, Alex's show is on display through May 31st, and we have a beautiful exhibition catalog available in our online shop. Feel free to reach out to me via email if you have any follow-up questions, and I hope you are all able to take another look at his show before it comes down in a couple weeks. Thank you, Alex, so much. This was a lot of fun, as always.
Thanks, Lillian. It was great. Thank you so much.
And thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank